2 children. One found dead at 14, impaled on a fence spike in his own grandparents' garden. One left without a mother before she turned 5. This is the heartbreaking fate that waited for Romy Schneider's 2 children, a son and a daughter, and it began years before either of them was born. December 1963, Paris. Romy Schneider was 25, engaged 4 years to Alain Delon, the golden couple of French cinema. That afternoon, a friend of Delon's left a bouquet of flowers and a letter on her table, then walked out before she had finished reading it. The engagement was over. Delon had already left the country for a woman who was carrying his child. By morning, a newspaper had told all of Paris before Romy had time to grieve it in private. She had no children of her own yet. But what was taken from her that afternoon did not stay contained to that winter. It took 3 years to reach a son, 14 to reach a daughter. Both would grow up inside what that apartment cost her, and one of them would not survive it. She was 15 the first time she appeared on screen beside her own mother, the actress Romy Schneider, in a small German film called When the White Lilacs Bloom Again. She was 16 when the role that would define the rest of her public life arrived, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, in a trilogy of films so beloved across German-speaking Europe that, 70 years later, they are still broadcast every Christmas, long after almost everything else from 1955 has been forgotten. The films made her rich and famous before she had finished growing up. They also, in her own telling, began quietly closing a door around her. "I was the princess, not just in front of the camera," she would later say. "I was always a princess. But one day I simply did not want to be a princess anymore." Her own father, the Austrian actor Wolf Albachretti, seemed to sense the danger of this early success even before she did. After her very first film, he wrote her a letter that read almost like a warning. "Put your childhood in your pocket and run away," he told her, "because that is everything you will ever have." She was born Rosemary Magdalena Albach in Vienna in September of 1938, into a family that had already been performing for a living for 2 generations, her mother a celebrated German film actress, her maternal grandmother an operetta star before that. Her parents divorced when she was still a small child, and she was raised largely by her mother, moving between Vienna and Berlin and the family's home near Berchtesgaden, in a household where the boundary between private life and public performance had never been especially clear to begin with. She was not discovered so much as she was assembled, a daughter groomed almost from birth into a profession her family already owned, cast for the first time at 15 not because anyone had asked what she wanted, but because the machinery around her had already decided what she would become. That is the context worth holding on to before anything else in this story. By the time Romy Schneider was old enough to fall in love with Alain Delon and imagine choosing her own life for the first time, she had already spent a decade inside an industry that had never once asked her permission. The Delon years were not simply a young woman's romance. They were the first time in her adult life she had chosen anything for herself at all. She did not run from the industry. She ran, instead, from the image the industry had built for her. In 1958, on the set of a French-German production called Christine, she met a young actor with no money, no English, and a bouquet of roses waiting for her at the airport gate. His name was Alain Delon, and he was on the edge of becoming one of the most famous men in French cinema. She fell for him the way people fall at 20, completely, and in public, and against the wishes of a family that had built her career and did not intend to lose control of it to a man they hadn't chosen. She left anyway. She moved to Paris to be with him, and the German press punished her for it. Headlines called Delon a kidnapper and called her a deserter of her own fans, as though loving a man outside the industry's plans for her was itself a kind of theft. She turned down, according to people who worked alongside her at the time, several million Deutschmarks in offers to return to German-language cinema and simply resume the career the studios had already mapped out for her. She was, by every count of these years, unrepentant about the choice. She had not run away from acting. She had run away from a single, flattened version of herself that acting had built before she was old enough to have any say in it, and she intended to keep running from it for as long as it took. In March of 1959, she and Delon were photographed newly engaged at Lake Lugano, at a villa belonging to her own father. She is laughing in the photograph in a way the camera rarely caught her doing later in her life, unguarded, certain of something. This is the last documented image of Romy Schneider before the wound arrived. A young woman who had already defied one industry, one family, and one flattened version of herself to build a life she had chosen on her own terms. She believed, standing at that villa in the spring sunlight, that love was something that gave back exactly what you put into it. She had 4 more years left to believe that. For nearly 5 years afterward, they were the story French cinema built its own mythology around. They lived together. They worked together, on stage and in front of the camera, and the same tabloids that had once condemned her for choosing him now could not print enough photographs of the two of them together. There is a detail biographers return to again and again when they describe the shape Delon had, from the beginning, been quietly setting for this relationship. Please listen carefully, he had told her once, according to friends who repeated it afterward. It is an easy thing. Let's marry if we do not quarrel for 3 months. It sounds, in hindsight, less like a promise than a test he had already half decided she would fail, a condition set by a man who was, even in the years he claimed to love her most, keeping one hand on the door. Then Delon's career began accelerating in a way a shared Paris apartment could not hold. There were rumors of an affair with a German actress the gossip pages called Nico. In the final months of 1963, the newspapers printed something Romy had not yet been told directly by the man himself. Alain Delon was engaged to a French actress named Nathalie Barthélemy, and she was already carrying his child. He did not end it in a conversation. He sent his friend Georges Baume to her apartment with a bouquet of flowers and a letter, then left the country to join the woman who would become his wife within the year. Within a day, a journalist named France Roch, Romy's own friend, announced the separation publicly in the pages of François. The end of a 5-year relationship was not left as private grief Romy could work through in her own time. It was turned, almost overnight, into a public event, printed for an entire country to read over its morning coffee before the woman at the center of it had finished absorbing what had happened to her. Delon married Nathalie within the year. Their son, Anthony, was born months later. He would go on to divorce and remarry more than once in the decades that followed, dating Brigitte Bardot, Dalida, Muriel Darc, moving through the rest of his life with the kind of freedom the era simply granted men in his position. The press treated each new relationship as evidence of his glamour. No one printed headlines asking what it meant that a man had left the love of his life with a bouquet and a note. Romy, for her part, would spend the following 2 decades doing the opposite of settling, and the same press that celebrated Delon's freedom would spend those same years describing hers as instability. 2 people living out the identical pattern, read through 2 entirely different lenses, depending only on which of them was doing it. Romy Schneider was left holding the story that had stopped, the moment François printed it, being entirely her own. People who knew her before 1963 and after use strikingly similar language to describe what changed. She did not become cold, and she did not become bitter in any way that showed on camera. She became fast. Within months of the breakup, she was working in Hollywood opposite Jack Lemmon in Good Neighbor Sam, then alongside Peter Sellers, Peter O'Toole, and Woody Allen in What's New Pussycat. Work had always been the place she went when she needed to stop feeling something, and now there was a great deal to stop feeling. Her private life across the years that followed reads like a woman testing, again and again, whether anyone could be trusted to actually stay. An affair with the German politician Willy Brandt, then with the director Louis Malle, then Sammy Davis Jr., then a string of others, each one shorter than the last, none of them approaching the 5 years she had already risked and lost. She was smoking up to 3 packs of Marlboro cigarettes a day by this point in her life. The press had given her a nickname that stuck for years afterward, Miss Worried. And then, in 1966, only 3 years after Delon's letter, she married the German director and actor Harry Mayen, quickly, by the standard of a woman who had once taken years to decide she loved someone enough to leave a country for him. Mayen was not a simple man to build a life beside. Born Harold Hobenstock in Hamburg, the son of a Jewish merchant, he had been incarcerated as a teenager at the Neuengamme concentration camp during the Nazi regime and had spent the rest of his life carrying what that survival had cost him: depression, heavy drinking, a dependence on drugs that friends and biographers traced directly back to what had been done to him as a boy of 18. He had rebuilt a respectable career from nothing after the war, working his way up from second-rate provincial theater to a contract at Hamburg's Thalia Theater, then into film and television, eventually lending his voice to the German dubs of Robert Mitchum and Peter Sellers. Romy did not know, when she married him, that she was building a household on top of 2 unhealed wounds instead of 1. They met in Berlin in the spring of 1965, at the opening of a restaurant owned by her stepfather, and by the summer of 1966 they were married in St. Jean Cap Ferrat, Romy already pregnant with David by the time the ceremony took place. It was, even by the standard of her own accelerated life since 1963, a fast decision. She had known him a little over a year. She did not slow down long enough to grieve what Delon's letter had taken from her. She built a marriage over it instead, the way people build a house across a fault line, because the fault line is invisible from the surface, and because standing still, for her, had come to feel far more dangerous than moving forward into whatever came next. There is a particular kind of survival that looks, from the outside, like resilience. A woman who keeps working, keeps marrying, keeps smiling for the cameras, is often praised for exactly the thing that is quietly costing her the most: the refusal to stop long enough to feel what happened to her. It is a pattern many women watching this will recognize in their own families, even if the details look nothing like a Paris apartment or a bouquet of roses. The parent who moved fast rather than sit still with a loss, who built the next thing before grieving the last one, and who never told the children exactly why the ground kept shifting under them. What follows in this story is what that refusal eventually asked her children to carry in her place. David Christopher was born in December of 1966, 5 months into the marriage, in a household built by a mother who had married quickly to outrun a wound she had never fully named, and a father whose own trauma was still, quietly, unresolved. The marriage strained almost from its beginning. Mayen struggled professionally, unable to match the scale of his wife's international fame, and struggled personally with the depression that had followed him since Neuengamme. David was 9 years old when his parents divorced in 1975. According to accounts from those close to the family, Mayen asked for half of Romy's fortune in the settlement and threatened to fight for custody of their son if he did not receive it, a threat that, whether or not it was ever seriously pursued, meant David's early years included the knowledge that he himself had, at some point, been a bargaining position in his parents' separation. Mayen's career grew scarcer after the divorce. His drinking grew heavier. On Easter Sunday, 1979, 3 years after the divorce was finalized, when David was 12 years old, Harry Mayen hanged himself at his home in Hamburg. He was found by his companion, the actress Anita Lochner. Romy, according to people close to her, felt a private and lasting guilt over his death, reportedly writing in her own diary that she should have taken better care of him, even though the marriage had ended years earlier and even though the wound that killed him had been inflicted long before she ever met him. David's childhood, in other words, was built on top of the same instability his mother had been quietly carrying since she was 25 years old, except now it was no longer a private ache that only she understood. It was custody threats. It was a father disappearing into his own collapse. It was a mother whose fame meant that even his private grief, when it eventually came, would not stay private for long. He was 14 when he died. On the 5th of July, 1981, only weeks before what would have been his 15th birthday, he was spending the day at the home of his grandparents, the parents of Daniel Biasini, his mother's second husband, in the Paris suburb of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. It was an ordinary family visit, the kind of unsupervised afternoon any 14-year-old might spend at his grandparents' house. He climbed to the top of a wrought iron gate. He slipped. He fell onto the sharp spikes below and ruptured his femoral artery, tearing a hole through his intestines in the process. Surgeons worked to repair the damage. He died on the operating table that same afternoon. News of his death reached the wire services within a day, described in the flat, procedural language of a police report: a 14-year-old boy, an iron fence, an accident. What the wire reports could not describe was the particular cruelty of where it happened, not a stranger's property, not an unfamiliar street, but the home of the family his mother had married into after Delon, after the letter, after everything she had already survived once. The wound that began in a Paris apartment in 1963 had, by 1981, traveled all the way into the one place that should have been safest for her son. By the time David died, his stepfather's household and his own mother's second marriage were already dissolving. Romy and Daniel Biasini divorced that same year. David had spent his short life moving between the fallout of one broken marriage and the beginning of another one ending, never quite landing anywhere long enough to call it settled. He did not choose the fence he climbed that afternoon out of carelessness alone. He was 14. Doing what 14-year-olds do at their grandparents' house on an ordinary summer day. But it is difficult, looking at the whole shape of his short life, not to notice how little steady ground he had ever actually been given to stand on. David never lived long enough to describe, in his own words, what he had inherited from a family history that predated him by 3 years. What he received instead was silence about where the instability had come from, and then an ending no 14-year-old's inheritance should ever have to include. Sarah Magdalena was born in July of 1977 in Saint-Tropez, the daughter of Romy's second marriage, to Daniel Biasini, once her own private secretary before he became her husband. By the time Sarah arrived, her mother was 38 years old, already once divorced and now in her second marriage, 14 years past the letter that had first taught her that devotion could be withdrawn without warning. Where David's household had strained slowly across 9 years before finally breaking, Sarah's began to break almost immediately. Her parents' marriage lasted only a handful of years. Daniel and Romy divorced in 1981, the same year, weeks apart, that her half-brother David died at his grandparents' house. Sarah was 3 years old that July, still 2 weeks from her own birthday. She would turn 5 only after her mother, unable to recover from what that year had taken from her, was found dead in her Paris apartment the following spring. Sarah has said, in interviews given decades later, that she was simply too young when her mother died to have formed memories of her own. Everything she came to know about Romy Schneider, she has explained, arrived secondhand, through films, through photographs, through the recollections of adults who had known a woman Sarah herself had never had the chance to actually meet as anything other than an infant. David inherited instability that accumulated slowly, year by year, until it broke him open. Sarah inherited absence almost immediately, arriving into a household that was already exhausted before she was old enough to understand what exhaustion even was. After her mother's death, Sarah was raised entirely by her father, the same Daniel Biasini whose own parents' home had, less than a year earlier, been the site of David's accident. A man who had lost his marriage, watched his former stepson die at his own family's house, and then found himself the sole parent responsible for raising the small daughter of a woman an entire country still insisted it had loved. Sarah has said, in the years since, that she does not resent the father who raised her for it, that he gave her, as best he could, the ordinary and unglamorous stability her mother had never had the chance to give either of her children. She studied art history at the Sorbonne before eventually training as an actress herself, at the Lee Strasberg Institute in Los Angeles and the Actors Studio in New York. Following her mother and grandmother into the same profession neither of them had ever fully managed to escape. It is, in its own way, a third generation inheriting the same industry that first made a princess out of a 15-year-old girl in 1953, carried forward now by a granddaughter who never had the chance to be told, by the woman herself, what the inheritance had actually cost. If you're finding the way this particular family's grief kept landing on different children in different shapes, never quite finished with any of them, this is the kind of story we come back to often. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one. There is a version of this story where David's death and Sarah's early loss are simply two separate tragedies that happened to occur in the same family. They were not separate. They were the same wound arriving twice, compressed into less than a single year. David died in July of 1981. Sarah's parents finalized their divorce that same year. Romy Schneider, grieving a 14-year-old son, unmarried again, drinking more heavily than she had at any point since Mayan's death 2 years earlier, had, at most, 10 more months left to give to the daughter who was still small enough to need to be carried. Friends who watched her during this period describe a woman who kept working, because work had always been the one structure she trusted completely, filming what would become her final role, La Passante du Sans Souci, that same winter. But the presence a 4-year-old needed and the presence a devastated 43-year-old woman had left to give were no longer close to the same size. Neither of her children received a mother at rest. David grew up inside a marriage assembled too quickly on top of an unhealed heartbreak, then inside its collapse, then inside a father's suicide he was too young to have any language for. Sarah grew up inside the immediate aftermath of her brother's death, inside her mother's spiraling grief, and then inside no mother at all. What passed between the letter delivered in 1963 and these two children was never affection Romy withheld on purpose. It was time, the ordinary, unglamorous, uneventful time a settled parent has to give a child, and by the time each of them needed it most, there simply wasn't enough of it left. There is also this, which biographers tend to mention only briefly, though it belongs at the center of this movement rather than at its edge. David and Sarah barely had the chance to know each other. 11 years apart in age, raised for most of their childhoods in different households by different fathers, they were half-siblings who shared a mother more than they shared a life. Sarah was 3 years old when David died, old enough, just barely, that some fragments of him may have survived in her memory alongside the fragments of her mother, though she has never claimed to remember either with any certainty. Whatever bond the two of them might have grown into, given more time, was foreclosed the same summer it should have still been building. Romy Schneider did not hide what David's death had done to her. At the scene, witnesses reported she turned on the photographers who had gathered outside the hospital, denouncing both them and the newspapers that would print the pictures anyway within days. By every account from the people who knew her, she was a mother visibly and permanently altered, not composed in front of the cameras the way the industry had trained her to be since she was 15, but openly breaking apart in front of people who had, until that point, only ever been allowed to photograph her when she had chosen to let them. She began drinking more heavily in the months that followed. She kept working regardless. The 2 César Awards she had already won, for that most important thing, Love in 1976 and A Simple Story in 1978, had made her one of the defining actresses in French cinema. And even in the middle of her grief she returned to a film set that winter, because it was the only place she had ever fully known how to hold herself together in public. Colleagues on that final production later described a woman who was professional to the point of rigor on set, and who fell apart privately the moment the cameras stopped rolling, the same split screen she had been performing, in one form or another, since she was 15 years old. Early in 1982, she underwent a kidney operation. Some of the people closest to her in her final weeks, including her friend Claude Payton, later insisted that she had stopped drinking entirely by that point, and that whatever ultimately ended her life was physical rather than the ending the tabloids assumed. There is no surviving record of Romy Schneider ever sitting down and explaining, plainly, what she believed her son's death had done to her daughter, or what she feared it might mean for the little girl still in the apartment with her. What survives instead is behavior, The drinking, the return to work, the kidney operation, the refusal, in every interview she gave in her final year, to claim she had found any way through her own grief. If she knew what all of this was costing Sarah in real time, she never said so where anyone could later quote her on it. That silence is in its own way a kind of answer. What is not disputed by anyone who was in her life during those final 10 months is this: she never once described herself, to a friend or a journalist or in any surviving interview, as having recovered. She was found dead in her Paris apartment on the 29th of May, 1982, by her last companion, the film producer Laurent Peyton. The examining magistrate declared the cause of death cardiac arrest. The tabloids, within days, were suggesting something else entirely: a deliberate overdose of sleeping pills, a final surrender rather than a natural failure of the heart. No autopsy was ever ordered to settle the question either way. She had lived, since she was 15 years old, as a woman whose private grief was never fully allowed to remain private, and even her death was not spared that same public argument over what it meant and who was responsible for it. Watching a mother's grief become public property, the way Romy's did after David's death, it's worth sitting for a moment on what that costs a family that is still, at that exact moment, trying to hold itself together in private. The country that had spent 30 years watching this woman perform composure never once asked what it would take from her, or from the small daughter still living in the same apartment, to keep performing it through this. David left nothing behind in his own words. He was 14, and children who die at 14 do not leave memoirs or interviews. They leave graves and the decisions other people make on their behalf afterward. It was Alain Delon, the same man whose abandonment had begun this entire story 19 years earlier, who arranged, after Romy's own death in 1982, for David's remains to be moved so that mother and son could be buried together. The man who had once walked out of her life with a bouquet and a note spent one of his final gestures toward her, making certain she and her son would not be separated in the ground. Sarah's testimony arrived decades later, and it arrived the way grief so often does when a person finally survives long enough to look directly at it. In May of 2017, she received a phone call from the police. Her mother's grave, at Boissy Sans-Savoir, had been desecrated. 3 weeks after that call, she learned she was pregnant with her first child. She would later write that the two events, arriving almost on top of one another, were what finally pushed her to sit down and try to reconstruct the mother she had never really had the chance to know. She wrote the resulting book, La Beauté du Ciel, at the age of 43, the exact age her own mother had been when she died. She has described writing it as a letter addressed to her own daughter, so that the silence that had surrounded Romy Schneider in her own childhood would not simply repeat itself into the next generation without explanation. In it, she pushed back directly against a public image of her mother that had calcified in the decades since 1982, including a 2018 film, 3 Days in Quiberon, whose portrayal of Romy as consumed by alcoholism in her final days Sarah has publicly rejected as untrue to the woman she spent years piecing back together from photographs, film reels, and other people's fragmented memories rather than her own. She has spoken, too, about the particular strangeness of introducing her mother's own films to audiences decades later, standing on a stage beside a screen showing a woman she cannot remember ever actually speaking to. Watching César et Rosalie, she has said, is the closest she has come to knowing what her mother's voice sounded like when it wasn't performing grief for a camera. A film with no violence, no cruelty, nothing but a woman handling the ordinary difficulties of her own life with a strength Sarah has come to recognize, slowly, as something closer to a real inheritance than anything else she was given. Her funeral, in June of 1982, drew a small circle of the people who had actually known her rather than simply photographed her. Jean-Claude Brialy, Mitchell Piccoli, Jean-Luc Dabadie, Jean Rochefort. Delon was there too, quietly involved in organizing much of it, arranging for Romy to be buried in the village where she had bought her final home only a month before her death. Weeks after the funeral, she received a posthumous César nomination for her final film, one of only two performers in the history of the award to be nominated after death. It was, in its way, the last irony of a life built almost entirely inside a camera's frame. The country that had spent 30 years documenting every stage of her private unraveling now wanted, one more time, to formally applaud it. Of everything Sarah Biasini has said publicly about the mother she was too young to remember, one sentence carries the full weight of what this family lost, and what one daughter fought, decades later, to recover anyway. David is buried beside his mother in the small cemetery at Boissy-Saint-Sauveur, in the village where Romy had bought a house only a month before she died, the last home she ever chose for herself, and now the resting place for both of them together. Sarah is alive, working as an actress in the same industry that made her mother famous at 15 and never entirely let her go afterward. She has a daughter of her own now, born in 2018 and named Anna, a granddaughter Romy Schneider never lived to meet, and whose arrival is, in its own quiet way, the closest thing this story has to an answer for the wound it has been tracing since a December afternoon in 1963. Sarah did not disappear into the instability she was handed. She sat down and wrote it out, addressed it directly to the next generation instead of letting it pass forward unnamed, the way it had passed to her. Since 1984, 2 years after her death, the French film industry has awarded the Prix Romy Schneider each year to a rising young actress, a prize named for a woman whose own rise, at 15, had never once been asked whether she wanted it. It is a strange kind of afterlife. An industry that helped assemble the wound now hands out awards in the name of the woman it happened to a new generation of young actresses standing exactly where she once stood, at the very beginning of the same machinery. The flowers and the letter left in a Paris apartment 61 years ago could not have known, at the time, what they would eventually cost: a marriage built too quickly over an unhealed wound, a son who grew up inside its slow collapse, a daughter who arrived just in time to lose nearly everything before she was old enough to remember any of it. But somewhere in a woman who was 4 years old when her mother died, and who is a mother herself now, the pattern finally found a place willing to stop passing it forward in silence. Sarah has spoken about what it meant to become a mother herself in the years after writing her book, how carefully she thinks now about the ordinary, unglamorous presence her own daughter needs, the kind of steady and dramatic attention that was never available to her at that age. It is not a redemption story in any tidy sense. Romy Schneider's wound did real and lasting damage to both of her children, and nothing written decades later changes what either of them actually lived through. But it is, at minimum, the place where the silence finally stopped moving forward on its own. My mother, Sarah Biasini wrote, is the beauty in the sky,